His opposition counterpart, Shadow Agriculture Minister Joel Fitzgibbon, is critical of the government's response so far, saying they've dropped the baton that Labor passed on.
Well, we certainly should have a lot of focus. The situation is very bad and growing worse, and the government needs to act, and act quickly. I was very disappointed in the Prime Minister yesterday, suggesting that things will improve by bringing the July 1 payment forward. The reality is that there's very little difference between the July 1 payment and the transitional payment, and I suspect on advice that it's not possible to bring it forward because of some IT constraints.
But isn't that still something, at least?
Well, if I'm advised that the final access arrangements for the July 1 program haven't even yet been determined. Now, if he's talking about relaxing those, fine. But if he's only talking about bringing it forward, and he wasn't very clear about this, then I fear that he really has misled Australian farmers by suggesting that somehow would help them.
But in saying that, Mr Fitzgibbon, it was your government that instigated a review of drought policy back in 2008. Don't you need to shoulder some of the blame for the hole that there is now?
I think drought reform policy, which has been an ongoing exercise since 1992, has been all too patchwork and slow. But we took the challenge on very seriously, I think, for the first time. And the problem here, of course, is that we were only in phase 1 of that drought reform program. We got an in-principle intergovernmental agreement with the states to dispense with the EC arrangements, all importantly to leave a household support payment in place, which is what the transitional payment is leading up to July 1. But the aspiration for us next was to put in place through the COAG process some sort of natural disaster relief payment in cooperation and conjunction with the states. Now, in the 6 months they've been in government, they haven't progressed that process, and we're left with the stage 1 payment alone and nothing else.
So you're saying that the previous Labor government was moving down the path of instituting natural disaster relief arrangements in cases of drought?
We were indeed, and if you have a look at the last intergovernmental agreement, it talks about the objectives of moving forward with further meetings.
But Mr Fitzgibbon, it is easy to say what you might have done, but you lost that last election, didn't get through to that stage. Why didn't all that happen years earlier?
Well, I've heard many commentators and experts say that this drought's been growing worse on a month-by-month basis. We went into caretaker mode 7 months ago now, so it's about time Tony Abbott started taking responsibility.
But the Labor Party was in power for a number of years prior to that.
The Labor Party, we were really progressing the changes. We did so on a bipartisan approach. There was no real criticism from the opposition at the time.
And when it comes to long-term planning, and that's what producers cry out for, they say there needs to be better long-term planning. But now they're in a drought situation where they need to see more of those in-drought support measures.
Yeah,
you'd be happy to extend bipartisan support to whatever is approved by Cabinet? This
is where Barnaby Joyce and I are in complete agreement. Drought-proofing and preparing for drought is one thing. But there are some events, like the one we seem to be facing now, which you can't plan for and no one could be expected to plan for, in the same way as a bank couldn't plan for a flood rushing through its doors. We need to recognise this is an extreme event and do something about it.
The Shadow Agriculture Minister Joel Fitzgibbon saying bipartisan support they would offer for anything that Cabinet does approve when it comes to drought assistance. All eyes now back to Barnaby Joyce to find out just what he does take into that Cabinet room in the next week or so. It's 12:17.